Chapter 12, The South Expands, Slavery and Society, 1800 to 1860. Life in South Carolina had been good to James Lidd, a slave-owning planter along the PD River. Lidd and his wife had raised 12 children and long resisted the Alabama fever that prompted thousands of Carolinians to move west. Finally, at age of 65, probably seeking land for his many offspring, he moved his slaves and family, including 6 children and 6 grandchildren, to a plantation near Montgomery, Alabama. There, the family lived initially in a squalid log cabin with air holes but no windows. Even after building a new house, the Lidd's life remained unsettled. Quote, "Pa is quite in the notion of moving somewhere," end quote, his daughter Maria reported. Although James Lidd died in Alabama, many of his children moved on. In 1854, at the age of 58, Eli Lidd migrated to Texas, telling his father, quote, "Something within me whispers, onward and onward." The Lidd story was that of Southern society. Between 1800 and 1860, white planters moved west and, using the muscles and sweat of 1 million enslaved Africans, brought millions of acres cultivation. By 1840, the South was at the cutting edge of the American market revolution. It annually produced and exported 1.5 million bales of raw cotton, over 2/3 of the world's supply, and its economy was larger and richer than that of most nations. Quote, "Cotton is king," end quote, boasted the Southern cultivator. No matter how rich they were, few cotton planters in Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas lived in elegant houses or led cultured lives. They had forsaken the aristocratic gentility of the Chesapeake and the Carolinas to make money. Quote, "To sell cotton in order to buy Negroes, to make more cotton to buy more Negroes, ad infinitum, is the aim of the thoroughgoing cotton planter," end quote. A traveler reported from Mississippi in 1835, quote, "His whole soul was wrapped up in the pursuit," end quote. Plantation women lamented the loss of genteel surroundings and polite society. Raised in North Carolina, where she was, quote, "blessed with every comfort and even luxury," end quote, Mary Drake found Mississippi and Alabama, quote, "a dreary waste," end quote. Enslaved African Americans knew what dreary waste really meant: unremitting toil, unrelieved poverty, and profound sadness. Sold south from Maryland, where his family had lived for generations, Charles Ball's father became, quote, "gloomy and morose," end quote, and ran off and disappeared. With good reason, on new cotton plantations, slaves labored from, quote, "sun up to sundown," end quote, and from one end of the year to the other. Forced to work by the threat of the lash, always wanting more, Southern planters and politicians plotted to extend their plantation economy across the continent. The domestic slave trade. In 1817, when the American Colonization Society began to transport a few freed blacks to Africa, the Southern plantation system was expanding rapidly. In 1790, its western boundary ran through the middle of Georgia. By 1830, it stretched through the western Louisiana. By 1860, the slave frontier extended far into Texas. That advance of 900 miles more than doubled the geographical area cultivated by slave labor and increased the number of slave states from 8 in 1800 to 15 by 1850. The federal government played a key role in this expansion. It acquired Louisiana from the French in 1803, welcomed the slave states of Mississippi and Alabama into the Union in 1817 and 1819, removed Native Americans from the southeastern states in the 1830s, and annexed Texas and Mexican lands in the 1840s. To cultivate this vast area, white planters imported enslaved laborers first from Africa and then from the Chesapeake region. Between 1776 and 1809, when Congress outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, planters purchased about 115,000 Africans. Quote, "The planter will sacrifice everything to attain Negroes," end quote, declared one slave trader. Despite the influx, the demand for labor far exceeded the supply. Consequently, planters imported new African workers illegally through the Spanish colony of Florida until 1819, and then through the Mexican province of Texas. Yet these Africans, about 50,000 between 1810 and 1865, did not satisfy the demand. The Upper South exports slaves. Planters seeking labor looked to the Chesapeake region, home in 1800 to nearly half of the nation's black population. There, the African American population was growing rapidly from natural increase, an average of 27% a decade by the 1810s, and creating a surplus of enslaved workers on many plantations. The result was a growing domestic trade in slaves. Between 1818 and 1829, planters in just one Maryland tobacco county, Frederick, sold at least 952 slaves to traders or cotton planters. Plantation owners in Virginia disposed of 75,000 slaves during the 1810s and again during the 1820s. The number of forced Virginia migrants jumped to nearly 120,000 during the 1830s, and then averaged 85,000 during the 1840s and 1850s. In Virginia alone, then, slave owners ripped 440,000 African Americans from communities where their families had lived for 3 or 4 generations. By 1860, the, quote, mania for buying Negroes, end quote, from the Upper South had resulted in a massive transplantation of more than 1 million slaves. A majority of African Americans now lived and worked in the Deep South, the lands that stretched from Georgia to Texas. The African American migration took two forms, transfer and sale. Looking for new opportunities, thousands of Chesapeake and Carolina planters, men like James Lidd, sold their existing plantations and moved their slaves to the Southwest. Many other planters gave the slaves to sons and daughters who moved west. Such transfers accounted for about 40% of the African American migrants. The rest, about 60% of 1 million migrants, were, quote, sold south, end quote, through traders. Just as the Atlantic slave trade enriched English merchants in the 18th century, so did the domestic market brought wealth to American traders between 1800 and 1860. One set of routes ran to the Atlantic coast and sent thousands of slaves to sugar plantations in Louisiana, the former French territories that entered the Union in 1812. As sugar output soared, slave traders scoured the countryside near the port cities of Baltimore, Alexandria, Richmond, and Charleston, searching, as one of them put it, for, quote, likely young men such as I would think would suit the New Orleans market, end quote. Each year, hundreds of muscular young slaves passed through auction houses in the port cities bound for the massive trade mart in New Orleans. Because of this, coastal trade in laborers was highly visible. It elicited widespread condemnation by Northern abolitionists. Sugar was a, quote, killer, end quote, crop. In Louisiana, like the 18th century West Indies, soon had a well-deserved reputation among African Americans as, quote, as a place of slaughter, end quote. Hundreds died each year from disease, overwork, and brutal treatment. Maryland farmer John Anthony Munichison refused to allow his daughter Priscilla to marry a Louisiana sugar planter, declaring, quote, Mitt has never been used to see Negroes flayed alive, and it would kill her, end quote. The inland system that fed slaves to the Cotton South was less visible than the coastal trade, but more extensive. Professional slave traders went from one rural village to another, buying, quote, young and likely Negroes, end quote. The traders marched their purchases in coffles, columns of slaves bound to one another, to Alabama, Mississippi, and Missouri in the 1830s, and to Arkansas and Texas in the 1850s. One slave described the arduous journey, quote, them speculators would put the chillins in a wagon, usually pulled by oxen, and the older folks was chained or tied together so as they could not run off, end quote. Once a coffle reached its destination, the trader would sell slaves, quote, at every village in the county, end quote. Chesapeake and Carolina planters provided the human cargo. Some planters sold slaves when poor management or their, quote, own extravagances, end quote, threw them into debt. Quote, trouble gathers thicker and thicker around me, end quote. Thomas B. Chaplin of South Carolina lamented in his diary, quote, I will be compelled to send about 10 prime Negroes to town on the next Monday to be sold, end quote. Many more planters doubled as slave traders, earning substantial profits by traveling south to sell some of their slaves and those of their neighbors. Thomas Weatherly of South Carolina drove his surplus slaves to Haynesville, Alabama, where he, quote, sold 10 Negroes, end quote. Colonial E.S. Irving, a member of the South Carolina legislature and, quote, a highly respected gentleman, end quote, in white circles, likewise traveled frequently to, quote, sell a drove of Negroes, end quote. Prices marched in step with those for cotton. During the boom of the 1850s, a planter noted that a slave will, quote, fetch $1,000 cash quick, end quote. The domestic slave trade was crucial to the prosperity of the migrating white planters because it provided workers to fell the forest and plant cotton in the Gulf states. Equally important, it sustained the wealth of slave owners in the Upper South by selling surplus black workers, tobacco, rice, and grain producers in the Chesapeake and Carolinas added about 20% to their income. As a Maryland newspaper remarked in 1858, quote, the trade serves as an almost universal resource to raise money. A prime able-bodied slave is worth 3 times as much to the cotton or sugar planter as to the Maryland agriculturalist, end quote. The impact on blacks. For African-American families, the domestic slave trade was a personal disaster that underlined their status and vulnerability as chattel slaves. In law, they were the movable personal property of the whites who owned them. As Lewis Clark, a fugitive from slavery, noted, quote, many a time I've had him say to me, you're my property, end quote. Quote, the being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle, end quote, declared former slave James W.C. Pennington. As a South Carolina master put it, quote, the slave's earnings belong to me because I bought him, end quote. Slave property underpinned the Southern economic system. Whig politician Henry Clay noted that the, quote, immense amount of capital which is invested in slave property is owned by widows and orphans, by the aged and infirm, as well as the sound and vigorous. It is the subject of mortgages, deeds of trust, and family settlements, end quote. Clay concluded, quote, I know that there is a visionary dogma which holds that Negro slaves cannot be the subject of property, but that is property, which the law declares to be property." End quote. As a slave owner, Clave also knew that property rights were key to slave discipline. Quote, "I govern them without the whip." End quote. Another master explained, quote, "by stating that I should sell them if they do not conduct themselves as I wish." End quote. The threat was effective. Quote, "The Negroes have dread nothing on earth so much as this." End quote. A Maryland observer noted, quote, "They regard the South with perfect horror, and to be sent there is considered as the worst punishment." End quote. Thousands of slaves suffered the fate which destroyed about 1 in every 4 slave marriages. Quote, "Why does the slave ever love?" End quote, asked Black abolitionist Harriet Jacobs in her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, when her partner, quote, "may at any moment be wrenched away by the hand of violence." End quote. After being sold, one Georgia slave lamented, quote, "My dear wife, for you and my children, my pen cannot express the grief I feel to be parted from you all." End quote. The interstate slave trade often focused on young adults. In northern Maryland, planters sold away boys and girls at an average rate of 17 years. Quote, "They sold my sister Kate," end quote. Anna Harris remembered decades later, quote, "and I ain't seed or heard of her since," end quote. The trade also separated almost a third of all slave children under the age of 14 from one or both of their parents. Sarah Grant remembered, quote, "Mama used to cry when she had to go back to work because she was always scared some of us kids would be sold away while she was away," end quote. Well, might she worry, for slave traders worked quickly. Quote, "One night I lay down on the straw mattress with my mammy," end quote. Vinnie Baker recalled, quote, "and at Axon next morning, I woke up, she was gone," end quote. When their owner sold 7-year-old Laura Clark and 10 other children from their plantation in North Carolina, Clark sensed that she would see her mother, quote, "no more in this life," end quote. Despite these sales, 75% of slave marriages remained unbroken, and the majority of children lived with one or both parents until puberty. Consequently, the sense of family among African Americans remained strong. Sold from Virginia to Texas in 1843, Hawkins Wilson carried with him a mental picture of his family. 25 years later, and now a freedman, Wilson set out to find his, quote, "dearest relatives," end quote, in Virginia. Quote, "My sister belonged to Peter Coleman in Caroline County, and her name was Jane. She had 3 children, Robert, Charles, and Julia, when I left. Sister Martha belonged to Dr. Jefferson. Sister Matilda belonged to Miss Botts," end quote. During the decades between sale and freedom, Hawkins Wilson and thousands of other African Americans constructed new lives for themselves in the Mississippi Valley. Undoubtedly, many did so with a sense of foreboding, knowing from personal experience that their owners could disrupt their lives at any moment. Like Charles Ball, some, quote, "long to die and escape from the bonds of my tormentors," end quote. The darkness of slavery shadowed even moments of joy. Knowing that sales often ended slave marriages, a white minister blessed one couple, quote, "for so long as God keeps them together," end quote. Many white planters, quote, "saw," end quote, only the African American marriages that endured and ignored those they had broken. Accordingly, many owners considered themselves benevolent masters, committed to the welfare of, quote, "my family, black and white," end quote. Some masters gave substance to this paternalistic ideal of treating kindly, quote, "loyal and worthy slaves," end quote. Black overseers, the mammy who raised their children, and trusted house servants. By preserving the families of these slaves, many planters could believe that they, quote, "sold South," end quote. Only coarse troublemakers and uncivilized slaves who had, quote, "little sense of family," end quote. Other owners were more honest about the human cost of their pursuit of wealth. Quote, "Tomorrow the Negroes are to get off to Kentucky," end quote. A slave-owning woman in Virginia wrote to a friend, quote, "and I expect there will be great crying and moaning, with children leaving their mothers, mothers their children, and women their husbands," end quote. Whether or not they acknowledged the slaves' pain, few Southern whites questioned the morality of slave trade. Responding to abolitionist criticism, the City Council of Charleston, South Carolina declared that, quote, "the removal of slaves from place to place and their transfer from master to master by gift, purchase, or otherwise," end quote, was completely consistent, quote, "with moral principle in the highest order of civilization," end quote. The world of Southern whites. American slavery took root in the early 18th century in the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake and in the rice fields of the Carolina Low Country. However, it grew to maturity during the first half of the 19th century on the cotton fields and sugar plantations of the Mississippi Valley. By then, a small elite of extraordinary wealthy planter families stood at the top of Southern society. These families, about 3,000 in number, each owned more than 100 slaves in huge tracts of the most fertile lands. Their ranks included many of the richest families in the United States. On the eve of the Civil War, Southern slave owners accounted for nearly 2/3 of all American men with wealth of $100,000 or more. Other white planters, backcountry yeoman farmers, and cotton planting tenants in particular, occupied some of the lowest rungs of the nation's social order. The expansion of Southern slavery, like the flowering of Northern capitalism, increased inequalities of wealth and status. The dual cultures of the planter elite. The westward movement split the plantation elite into two distinct groups: the traditional aristocrats of the Old South, whose families had gained their wealth from tobacco and rice, and the upstart capitalists, inclined planters of the cotton states. The traditional Southern gentry. The Old South gentry dominated the Tidewater region of the Chesapeake and the low country of South Carolina and Georgia. During the 18th century, these planters built impressive mansions and adopted the manners and values of the English landed gentry. Their aristocratic-oriented culture survived the Revolution of 1776 and soon took on a Republican glaze. Classical Republican theory, which had long identified political tyranny as a major threat to liberty, had its roots in the society of Greece and Rome, where slavery was part of the natural order of society. That variety of republicanism appealed to wealthy Southerners who feared federal government interference with their slave property. On the state level, planters worried about populist politicians who would mobilize poorer whites, and so they demanded that authority rest in the hands of incorruptible men of, quote, virtue, end quote. Indeed, affluent planters cast themselves as a Republican aristocracy. Quote, the planters here are essentially what the nobility are in other countries, end quote, declared James Henry Hammond of South Carolina. Quote, they stand at the head of society and politics and form an aristocracy of talents, of virtue, of generosity, and courage, end quote. Wealthy planters criticized the democratic polity and the middle-class society that was developing in the Northeast and Midwest. Quote, inequality is the fundamental law of the universe, end quote, declared one planter. Others condemned professional politicians as, quote, a set of demagogues, end quote, and questioned the legitimacy of universal suffrage. Quote, times are sadly different now to what they were when I was a boy, end quote, lamented David Gavin, a prosperous South Carolinian. Then the, quote, Southern people, alias mob, end quote, had little influence. Now they vied for power with the elite. Quote, how can I rejoice for a freedom, end quote, Gavin thundered, quote, which allows every bankrupt swindler, thief, and scoundrel, traitor, and seller of his vote to be placed on an equality with myself, end quote. To maintain their privileged identity, aristocratic planters married their sons and daughters to one another and expected them to follow in their footsteps. The men working as planters, merchants, lawyers, newspaper editors, and ministers, and the women hosting plantation balls and church bazaars. To confirm their social preeminence, they lived extravagantly and entertained graciously. James Henry Hammond built a Greek Revival mansion with the center hall 53 feet by 20 feet, its floors embellished with stylish Belgian tiles and expensive Brussels carpets. Quote, once a year, like a great feudal landlord, end quote, Hammond's neighbors recounted, quote, he gave a fete or grand dinner to all the country people, end quote. Rice planters remained at the apex of the plantation aristocracy. In 1860, the 15 proprietors of the vast plantations in All Saints Parish in South Carolina owned 4,383 slaves, nearly 300 apiece, who annually grew and processed 14 million pounds of rice. An inexpensive Asian rice entered the world market in the 1820s and cut their profits. The Carolina rice aristocrats sold some slaves and worked the others harder, sustaining their luxurious lifestyle. The, quote, hospitality and elegance, end quote, of Charleston and Savannah impressed savvy English traveler John Silk Buckingham. Buckingham likewise found, quote, polished, end quote, families among long-established French Catholic planters in the New Orleans and along the Mississippi River. There, the, quote, sugar and cotton planters live in splendid edifices and enjoyed all the luxury that wealth can impart, end quote. In tobacco-growing regions, the lives of the planter aristocracy followed a different trajectory, in part because slave ownership was widely diffused. In the 1770s, about 60% of white families in the Chesapeake region owned at least one African American. As wealthy tobacco planters moved their estates and slaves to the Cotton South, middling whites, who owned between 5 and 20 slaves, came to dominate the Chesapeake economy. The descendants of the old tobacco aristocracy remained influential, but increasingly as slave-owning grain farmers, lawyers, merchants, industrialists, and politicians. They hired out surplus slaves, sold them south, or allowed them to purchase their freedom. The ideology and reality of benevolence. The planter aristocracy flourished around the periphery of South Carolina's booming cotton belt, in Virginia, South Carolina, and Louisiana, but it took the lead in defending slavery. ignoring the Jeffersonian response to slavery as a, quote, misfortune, end quote, or a, quote, necessary evil, end quote. Southern apologists in the 1830s argued that the institution was a, quote, positive good, end quote, because it subsidized an elegant lifestyle for a white elite and provided tutelage for genetically inferior Africans. Quote, as a race, the African is inferior to the white man, end quote, declared Alexander Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy. Quote, subordination to the white man is his normal condition, end quote. Apologists depicted planters and their wives as aristocratic models of, quote, disinterested benevolence, end quote, who provided food and housing for their workers and cared for them in old age. One wealthy Georgian declared, quote, plantation government should be eminently patriarchal. The paterfamilies or head of the family should, in one sense, be the father of the whole concern, Negroes and all, end quote. Those planters who embraced Christian stewardship tried to shape the religious lives of their chattel. They built churches on their plantations, welcomed evangelical preachers, and required their slaves to attend services. A few African Americans with spiritual, quote, gifts, end quote, to serve as exhorters and deacons. Most of these planters acted from sincere Christian belief, but they also hoped to counter abolitionist criticism and to use religious teachings to control their workers. Indeed, slavery's defenders increasingly used religious justification for human bondage. Protestant ministers in the South pointed out the Hebrews, God's chosen people, had owned slaves and that Jesus Christ had never condemned slavery. As James Henry Hammond told a British abolitionist in 1845, quote, what God ordains and Christ sanctifies should surely command the respect and toleration of man, end quote. However, many aristocratic defenders of slavery were absentee owners or delegated authority to overseers, and they rarely glimpsed the day-to-day brutality of their regime of forced labor. Quote, I was at the plantation last Saturday, and the crop was in fine order, end quote. An absentee son wrote to his father, quote, but the Negroes are most brutally scarred, and several have run off, end quote. Cotton entrepreneurs. There was much less hypocrisy and far less elegance among the entrepreneur planters of the Cotton South. Quote, the glare of expensive luxury vanishes, end quote. In the black soil regions of Alabama and Mississippi, John Silk Buckingham remarked as he traveled through the Cotton South. Frederick Law Olmsted, the future architect of New York's Central Park, who during the mid-1850s traveled through the South for the New York Times, found that the plantations in Mississippi mostly had, quote, but small and mean residences, end quote. Aristocratic paternalism vanishes as well. A Mississippi planter put it plainly, quote, everything has to give way to large crops of cotton. Land has to be cultivated wet or dry. Negroes must work, hot or cold, end quote. Angry at being sold south and pressed to hard labor, many slaves grew mean and stubborn. Those who would not labor were subject to the lash. Quote, whipped all the hoe hands, end quote. Alabama planter James Torbert wrote matter-of-factly in his journal, overseers pushed workers hard because their salaries often depended on the amount of cotton they were able to, quote, to make for the market, end quote. A Mississippi slave recalled, quote, when I was so tired, I couldn't hardly stand. I had to spin my cut of cotton before I could go to sleep. We had to card, spin, and reel at night, end quote, end quote. Cotton was a demanding crop because of its long growing season. Slaves plowed the land in March, dropped seeds into the ground in early April, and once the plants began to grow, continually chopped away the surrounding grasses. In between these tasks, they planted the corn and peas that would provide food for them and the plantation's hogs and chickens. When the cotton bolls ripened in late August, the long 4-month picking season began. Slaves in the Cotton South, concluded Olmsted, worked, quote, much harder and more unremittingly, end quote, than those in the tobacco regions. Moreover, fewer of them acquired craft skills than in tobacco, sugar, and rice areas, where slave coopers and engineers made casts, processed sugar, and built irrigation systems. To increase output, profit-seeking cotton planters began during the 1820s to use a rigorous gang labor system. Previously, many planters had supervised their workers sporadically or assigned them specific tasks to complete at their own pace. Now masters with 20 or more slaves organized disciplined teams or, quote, gangs, end quote, supervised by black drivers and white overseers. They instructed the supervisors to work the gangs at a steady pace, clearing the plowland or hoeing and picking cotton. A traveler in Mississippi described 2 gangs returning from work. Quote, first came, then led by an old driver carrying a whip. 40 of the largest and strongest women I ever saw together. They were all in a simple uniform dress of bluish check stuff, the skirts reaching little below the knee. They carried themselves loftily, each having a hoe over the shoulder and walking with a free, powerful swing, end quote. Next marched the plow hands with their mules. Quote, the cavalry, 30 strong, mostly men, but a few of them women, end quote. Finally, quote, a lean and vigilant white overseer on a brisk pony brought up the rear, end quote. The gang labor system enhanced profits by increasing productivity because slaves and gangs finished tasks in 35 minutes that took a white yeoman planter an hour to complete. Gang labor became ever more prevalent. In one Georgia county, the percentage of blacks working in gangs doubled between 1830 and 1850. As the price of raw cotton surged after 1846, the wealth of the planter class skyrocketed. And no wonder, nearly 2 million enslaved African Americans now labored on the plantations of the Cotton South and annually produced 4 million bales of the valuable fiber. Planters, smallholding yeomen, and tenants. Although the South was a slave society, that is, a society in which the institution of slavery affected all aspects of life, most white Southerners did not own slaves. The percentage of white families who had blacks in bondage steadily decreased from 36% in 1830 to 31% in 1850 to about 25% a decade later. However, slave ownership varied by region. In some cotton-rich counties, 40% of the white families owned slaves. In the hill country near the Appalachian Mountains, the proportion dropped to 10%. Planter elites. A privileged minority of 395,000 Southern white families owned slaves in 1860. Their ranks divided into a strict hierarchy. The top 1/5 of these families owned 20 or more slaves. This elite, just 5% of the South's white population, dominated the economy, owning over 50% of the entire slave population of 4 million and growing 50% of the South's cotton crop. The average wealth of these planters was $56,000, about $1.6 million in purchasing power today. By contrast, a prosperous Southern yeoman or Northern farmer owned property worth a mere $3,200. Substantial proprietors, another 1/5 of the slave-owning population, held title to 6 to 20 bondsmen and women. These middling planters owned almost 40% of the enslaved laborers and produced more than 30% of the cotton. Often, they pursued dual careers as skilled artisans or professional men. Thus, some of the 15 slaves owned by Georgian Samuel L. Moore worked in his brick factory, while others labored on his farm. Dr. Thomas Gale used the income from his medical practice to buy a Mississippi plantation that annually produced 150 bales of cotton. In Alabama, lawyer Benjamin Fitzpatrick used his legal fees to buy 10 slaves. Like Fitzpatrick, lawyers acquired wealth by managing the affairs of the slave-owning elite, representing planters and merchants in suits for debt, and helping smallholders and tenants register their deeds and contracts. Standing at the legal crossroads of their small towns, they rose to prominence and regularly won election to public office. Less than 1% of the male population in 1828, lawyers made up 16% of the Alabama legislature, an astonishing 26% in 1849. Smallholding planters and yeomen. Smallholding slave owners were much less visible than the wealthy grandees and the middling lawyer planters. These planters held from 1 to 5 black laborers in bondage and owned a few hundred acres of land. Some smallholders were well-connected young men who would rise to wealth when their father's death blessed them with more land and slaves. Others were poor but ambitious men trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, often encouraged by elite planners and pro-slavery advocates. Quote, ours is a pro-slavery form of government, and the pro-slavery element should be increased, end quote, declared a Georgian newspaper. Quote, we would like to see every white man at the South, the owner of a family of Negroes, end quote. Some aspiring planters achieved modest prosperity. A German settler reported from Alabama in 1855 that, quote, nearly all of his countrymen, end quote, who emigrated with him were slaveholders. Quote, they were poor on their arrival in the country, but no sooner did they realize a little money than they invested in its slaves, end quote. Bolstered by the patriarchal ideology of the planter class, yeoman farmers ruled their small holdings with a firm hand. The male head of the household had legal authority over all the dependents, wives, children, and slaves. And according to one South Carolina judge, the right of his property, quote, to be as churlish as he pleases, end quote. Yeoman wives had very little power. Like women in the North, they lost their legal identity when they married. To express their concerns, many Southern women joined churches, where they usually outnumbered men by a margin of 2 to 1. Women especially welcomed the message of a spiritual equality preached in evangelical Baptist and Methodist churches, and they hoped that the church community would hold their husbands to the same standards of Christian behavior to which they conformed. However, most churches supported patriarchal rule and told female members to remain in wifely obedience, whatever the actions of their husbands. Whatever their authority within the household, most Southern yeomen lived and died as hardscrabble farmers. They worked alongside their slaves in the fields, struggled to make ends meet as their families grew, and moved regularly in search of opportunity. Thus, in 1847, James Buckner Berry left North Carolina with his new wife and 2 slaves to settle in Bosque County, Texas. There he worked part-time as an Indian fighter, while his slaves toiled on a drought-ridden farm that barely kept the family in food. In South Carolina, W.J. Simpson struggled for years as a small-holding cotton planter and then gave up. He hired out one of his 2 slaves and went to work as an overseer on his father's farm. Less fortunate smallholders fell from the privileged ranks of the slave-owning class, selling their land and slaves to pay off debts. They joined the mass of propertyless tenants who farmed the estates of wealthy landlords. In 1860, in Hancock County, Georgia, there were 56 slave-owning planters and 300 propertyless white farm laborers and factory workers. In nearby Hart County, 25% of the white farmers were tenants. Across the South, about 40% of the white population worked as tenants or farm laborers. As a Southern cultivator observed, they had, quote, no legal right nor interest in the soil and no homes of their own, end quote. Poor freemen. Propertyless whites suffered the ill consequences of living in a slave society that accorded little respect to hardworking white laborers. Nor could they hope for a better life for their children, because slave owners refused to pay taxes to fund public schools. Moreover, wealthy planters bid up the price of African Americans, depriving white laborers and tenants of easy access to the slave labor required to accumulate wealth. Finally, planter-dominated legislatures forced all white men, whether they owned slaves or not, to serve in the patrols and militias that deterred black uprisings. The majority of white Southerners, Frederick Olmsted concluded, quote, are poor. They have little, very little, of the common comforts and consolations of civilized life. Their destitution is not material only. It is intellectual and it is moral, end quote. Marking this moral destitution, poor whites enjoyed the psychological satisfaction that they ranked above blacks. As Alfred Iverson, a U.S. Senator from Georgia, explained, a white man, quote, walks erect in the dignity of his color and race and feels he is superior being, with the more exalted powers and privileges than others, end quote. To reinforce that sense of racial superiority, planter James Henry Hammond told his poor white neighbors, quote, in a slave country, every free man is an aristocrat, end quote. Rejecting the half-truth, many Southern whites fled planter-dominated counties in the 1830s and sought farms in the Appalachian Hill Country and beyond. In Western Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the southern regions of Illinois and Indiana and Missouri. Living as yeoman farmers, they used family labor to grow foodstuffs for subsistence, to obtain cash or store credit to buy agricultural implements, clothes, shoes, salt, and other necessities. Yeoman families sold their surplus crops, raised hogs for market sale, and when the price of cotton rose sharply, grew a few bales. Their goals were modest. On the family level, they wanted to preserve their holdings and buy enough land to set up their children as small-scale farmers. As citizens, smallholders wanted to control their local government and elect men of their own kind to public office. However, thoughtful yeomen understood that the slave-based cotton economy sentenced family farmers to a subordinate place in the social order. They could hope for a life of independence and dignity only by moving north or farther west, where labor was free and hard work was respected. Expanding and governing the South. By the 1830s, settlers from the South had carried both yeoman farming and plantation slavery into Arkansas and Missouri. Between those states and the Rocky Mountains stretched great grasslands. An Army explorer, Major Stevens H. Long, thought the Plains region, quote, almost wholly unfit for cultivation, end quote, and in 1820 labeled it the Great American Desert. The label stuck. Americans looking for land turned south to Mexican territory. At the same time, elite planters struggled to control state governments in the Cotton South. The settlement of Texas. After winning independence from Spain in 1821, the Mexican government pursued an activist settlement policy to encourage migration to the refigured state of Coahuila y Tejas. It offered sizable land grants to its citizens and to American immigrants. Moses Austin, an American land speculator, settled small-holding farmers on his large grant. And his son, Stephen F. Austin, acquired even more land, some 180,000 acres, which he sold to newcomers. By 1835, about 27,000 white Americans and their 3,000 African-American slaves were raising cotton and cattle in the well-watered plains and hills of eastern and central Texas. They far outnumbered the 3,000 Mexican residents who lived primarily near the southwestern Texas towns of Goliad and San Antonio. When Mexico in 1835 adopted a new constitution, creating a stronger central government and dissolving state legislatures, the Americans split into 2 groups, the, quote, War Party, end quote, led by Sam Houston, and recent migrants from Georgia, demanded independence for Texas. Members of the, quote, Peace Party, end quote, led by Stephen Austin, negotiated with the central government in Mexico City for greater political autonomy. They believed Texas could flourish within a decentralized Mexican republic, a federal constitutional system favored by the Liberal Party in Mexico and advocated in the United States by Jacksonian Democrats. Austin won significant concessions for the Texans, including an exemption from a law ending slavery. But in 1835, Mexico's president, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, nullified them. Santa Anna wanted to impose national authority throughout Mexico. Fearing central control, the War Party provoked a rebellion that most American settlers ultimately supported. On March 2, 1836, the American rebels proclaimed an independence of Texas and adopted a constitution legalizing slavery. To put down the rebellion, President Santa Anna led an army that wiped out the Texan garrison defending the Alamo in San Antonio and then captured Goliad, executing about 350 prisoners of war. Santa Anna thought that he had crushed the rebellion, but New Orleans and New York newspapers romanticized the deaths at the Alamo of folk heroes Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, drawing on anti-Catholic sentiment aroused by Irish immigration and the massacre of Goliad. They urged Americans to, quote, remember the Alamo, end quote, and depicted the Mexicans as tyrannical butchers in the service of the Pope. American adventurers lured by offers of land grants flocked to Texas to join the rebel forces. Commanded by General Sam Houston, the Texans routed Santa Anna's overconfident army in the Battle of San Juancito in April 1836, winning de facto independence. The Mexican government refused to recognize the Texas Republic, but for the moment did not seek to conquer it. The Texans voted for annexation by the United States, but President Martin Van Buren refused to bring the issue before Congress. As a Texas diplomat reported, the cautious Van Buren and other party politicians feared that annexation would spark a war with Mexico, and beyond that, a, quote, desperate death struggle between the North and the South over the extension of slavery, a struggle involving the probability of a dissolution of the Union, end quote. The politics of democracy. As national leaders refused admissions to Texas, elite planters faced political challenges in the Cotton South. Unlike the planter aristocrats who ruled the colonial world, they lived in a Republican society with a democratic ethos. The Alabama Constitution of 1890 granted suffrage to all white men. It also provided for secret ballot rather than voice voting, apportionment of legislative seats based on population, and the election of county supervisors, sheriffs, and clerks of court. Given these democratic provisions, political factions in Alabama had to compete for votes. When a Whig newspaper sarcastically asked whether the state's policy should be, quote, be governed and controlled by the whim and caprice of the majority of the people, end quote, Democrats hailed the power of the common folk. They called on, quote, farmers, mechanics, laboring men, end quote, to repudiate Whig, quote, aristocrats, the soft-handed and soft-headed gentry, end quote. Taxation policy. Whatever the electioneering rhetoric, most Whig and Democratic political candidates were men of substance. In the early 1840s, nearly 90% of Alabama's legislators owned slaves, testimony to the political power of the slave-owning minority. Still, relatively few lawmakers, only about 10%, were rich planters. A group of voters, by and large, distrusted, quote, a rich man cannot sympathize with the poor, end quote, declared one candidate. Consequently, the majority of elected state officials and most county officials in the Cotton South came from the ranks of middle-level planters and planter lawyers. Astute politicians, they refrained from laying, quote, oppressive, end quote, taxes on the people, particularly the white majority who owned no slaves. Between 1830 and 1860, the Alabama legislature obtained about 70% of the state's revenues from taxes on slaves and land. Another 10 to 15% came from levies on carriages, gold watches, and other luxury goods, and on the capital invested in banks, transportation companies, and manufacturing enterprises. To win the votes of tax-paying slave owners, Alabama Democrats advocated limited government and low taxes. They attacked their Whig opponents for favoring higher taxes and for providing government subsidies for banks, canals, railroads, and other internal improvements. Quote, voting against appropriations is the safe and popular side, end quote, one Democratic legislator declared, and his colleagues agreed. Until the 1850s, they rejected most of the bills that would have granted subsidies to transportation companies or banks. If tax policy in Alabama had a Democratic thrust, elsewhere in the South, it did not. In some states, wealthy planters used their political muscle to exempt slave property from taxation, or they shifted the burden to backcountry yeomen who owned low-quality pasture lands by taxing farms according to acreage rather than value. Planter legislatures also spared themselves the cost of building fences around their fields by enacting laws that required yeomen to, quote, fence in, end quote, their livestock. And during the 1850s, wealthy legislatures throughout the South used public lands to subsidize the canals and railroads in which they had invested, ignoring the protest of yeoman-backed legislatures. The paradox of Southern prosperity. Even without these internal improvements, the South had a strong economy. Indeed, it ranked fourth in the world in 1860, with a per capita income among whites higher than that of France and Germany. As a contributor to Georgia newspaper argued in the 1850s, planters and yeomen should not complain about, quote, tariffs and merchants and manufacturers, end quote, because the most highly prosperous people now on earth are to be found in these very slave states, end quote. Such arguments tell only part of the story. Nearly all African Americans, 40% of the population, lived in dire and permanent poverty. And although the average Southern white man was 80% richer than the average Northerner in 1860, the Southerner's non-slave wealth was only 60% of the Northern average. Moreover, the wealth of the industrializing Northeast was increasing at a faster pace than that of the South. Between 1820 and 1860, slave-related trade across the Atlantic declined 12.6% of world trade to 5.3%. Influential Southerners blamed the shortcomings of their plantation-based economy on outsiders, quote, purely agricultural people, end quote, intoned slave-owning planter politician James Henry Hammond, quote, have been in all ages the victims of rapacious tyrants grinding them down, end quote. And they steadfastly defended their way of life. Quote, we have no cities. We don't want them, end quote, boasted U.S. Senator Louis Wigfall of Texas in 1861. Quote, we want no manufacturing. We desire no trading, no mechanical or manufacturing classes. As long as we have our rice, our sugar, our tobacco, and our cotton, we can command wealth to purchase all we want, end quote. So wealthy Southerners continued to buy land and slaves, a strategy that neglected investments in the great technological improvements of the 19th century. Water and steam power factories, machine tools, steel plows, and crushed gravel roads that would have raised the South's productivity and wealth. Urban growth, the key to prosperity in Europe and the North, occurred primarily in the commercial cities around the periphery of the South, New Orleans, St. Louis, and Baltimore. Factories, often staffed at slave labor, appeared primarily in the Chesapeake region, which had a diverse agricultural economy and a surplus of bound workers. Within the Cotton South, wealthy planters invested in railroads primarily to grow more cotton. When the Western and Atlantic Railroad reached the Georgia upcountry, the cotton crop there quickly doubled. Cotton and agriculture remained king. Slavery also deterred Europeans from migrating to the South because they feared competition from bound labor. Their absence deprived the region of skilled artisans and of hardworking laborers to drain swamps, dig canals, smelt iron, and work on railroads. When entrepreneurs tried to hire slaves for these dangerous tasks, planters replied that, quote, a Negro's life is too valuable to be risked, end quote. Slave owners also feared that hiring out would make their slaves too independent. As a planter told Frederick Law Olmsted, such workers, quote, had too much liberty and got a habit of roaming about and taking care of themselves, end quote. Thus, despite its increasing size and booming exports, the South remained an economic colony. Great Britain and the North bought its staple crops and provided its manufacturers financial services and shipping facilities. In 1860, some 84% of Southerners, more than double the percentage in the northern state, still worked in agriculture, and Southern factories turned out only 10% of the nation's manufacturing goods. The South's fixation on, quote, exclusive and exhausting, end quote, systems of cotton monoculture and slave labor filled South Carolina textile entrepreneur William Gregg with, quote, dark forebodings, end quote. Quote, it has produced us such an abundant supply of all the luxuries and elegance of life, with so little exertion on our part, that we have become inebriate, unfitted for other and more laborious pursuits, end quote. The African American world. By the 1820s, the cultural life of most slaves reflected both the values and customs of their West African ancestors and the language, laws, and religious beliefs of the South's white population. The mix of African and European-derived cultural values persisted for decades because whites discouraged blacks from assimilating and because slaves prized their diverse African heritages. Evangelical Black Protestantism. The emergence of Black Christianity illustrated the synthesis of African and European cultures. From the 1790s to the 1840s, the Second Great Awakening swept over the South, and evangelical Baptist and Methodist preachers converted thousands of white families and hundreds of enslaved blacks. Until that time, African-born blacks, often identifiable by their ritual scars, had maintained the religious practices of their homelands. African religions and Christian conversion. Africans carried their traditional religious practices to the United States. Some practiced Islam, but the majority relied on African gods and spirits. As late as 1842, Charles C. Jones, a Presbyterian minister, noted that blacks on his family's plantation in Georgia believed, quote, in second sight, in apparitions, charms, witchcraft, and other superstitions brought from Africa, end quote. Fearing for their own souls if they withheld, quote, the means of salvation, end quote, from African Americans, Jones and other zealous Protestant preachers and planters set out to convert slaves. Other Protestant crusaders came with the ranks of pious black men and women who had become Christians in the Chesapeake. Swept to the Cotton South by the domestic slave trade, They carried with them evangelical message of emotional conversion, ritual baptism, and communal spirituality. Equally important, these crusaders adapted Protestant doctrines to Black needs. Enslaved Christians pointed out that Blacks as well as whites were, quote, children of God, end quote, and should be treated accordingly. Black Protestantism generally ignored the doctrines of original sin and predestination, and preachers didn't use biblical passages that encouraged unthinking obedience to authority. A white minister in Liberty County, Georgia, reported that when he urged slaves to obey their masters, quote, one half of my audience deliberately rose up and walked off, end quote. Black worship. Indeed, some African American converts envisioned the deity as the Old Testament warrior who had liberated the Jews and so would liberate them. Inspired by a vision of Christ, Nat Turner led his bloody rebellion against slavery in Virginia. Other Black Christians saw themselves as chosen people, quote, the people that is born of God, end quote. Charles Davenport, a Mississippi slave, recalled Black preachers, quote, exhorting us that us the children of Israel, into wilderness and the Lord, done sought us take the land of milk and honey, end quote. Still, African Americans expressed their Christianity in distinctive ways. The thousands of Blacks who joined the Methodist Church respected its ban on profane dancing, but praised the Lord in what minister Henry George Spalding called the, quote, religious dance of the Negroes, end quote. Spalding described the African-derived, quote, ring shout, end quote, this way, quote, 3 or 4 standing still, clapping their hands and beating time with their feet, commence singing in unison, one of the peculiar shout melodies, while the others walk around in a ring, in single file joining also in the song, end quote. The songs themselves were usually collective creations, devised spontaneously from bits of old hymns and tombs. By such African-influenced means, Black congregationists devised a distinctive and joyous brand of Protestant worship to sustain them on the long journey to emancipation in the Promised Land. Quote, oh, my Lord, deliver Daniel, end quote. The slave saying, quote, oh, why not deliver me too, end quote. Forging families and communities. Black Protestantism was one facet of an increasingly homogeneous African-American culture in the rural South. Even in South Carolina, a major point of entry for imported slaves, only 20% of Black residents in 1820 had been born in Africa. The domestic slave trade mingled Blacks from many states, erased regional differences, and prompted the emergence of a core culture in the lower Mississippi Valley. A prime example was the fate of the Gullah dialect, which combined words from English and a variety of African languages in an African grammatical structure. Spoken by Blacks in the Carolina Lowcountry, well into the 20th century, Gullah did not take root on the cotton plantations of Alabama and Mississippi. There, slaves from Carolina were far outnumbered by migrants from the Chesapeake who spoke Black English. Like Gullah, Black English used double negatives and other African grammatical forms, but it consisted primarily of English words rendered with West African pronunciation. Nonetheless, African influences remained significant. At least 1/3 of slaves who entered the United States between 1776 and 1809 came from the Congo region of West Africa, and they brought their cultures with them. As traveler Isaac Holmes reported in 1821, quote, in Louisiana and the state of Mississippi, the slaves danced for several hours during Sunday afternoon. The general movement is in what they called the Congo dance, end quote. Similar descriptions of Blacks who, quote, danced the Congo and sang a purely African song to the accompaniment of a drum, end quote, appeared as late as 1890. African Americans also continued to respect African incest taboos by shunning marriages between cousins. On the Good Hope Plantation in South Carolina, nearly half of the slave children born between 1800 and 1857 were related by blood to one another. Yet when they married, only 1 of every 41 unions took place between cousins. White planters were not the source of this taboo. Cousin marriages were frequent among the 440 South Carolina men and women who owned at least 100 slaves in 1860, in part because such unions kept wealth within an extended family. Unlike white marriages, slave unions were not legally binding. According to a Louisiana judge, quote, slaves have no legal capacity to assent to any contract because slaves are deprived of any civil rights, end quote. Nonetheless, many African Americans took marriage vows before Christian ministers or publicly marked their union in ceremonies that included the West African custom of jumping over a broomstick together. Once married, newly arrived young people in the Cotton South often chose older people in their new communities as fictive aunts and uncles. The slave trade had destroyed their family, but not their family values. The creation of fictive kinship ties was part of a community-building process, a partial substitute for the family ties that sustained whites during periods of crisis. Naming children was another. Recently, imported slaves frequently gave their children African names. Males born on Friday, for example, were called Kufi, the name of that day in several West African languages. Many American-born parents chose names of British origin, but they usually named their sons after fathers, uncles, or grandfathers, and daughters after grandmothers. Those transported to the Cotton South often named their children for relatives left behind. Like incest rules and marriage rituals, this intergenerational sharing of names evoked memories of a lost world and bolstered kin ties to the new one. Negotiating rights. By forming stable families and communities, African Americans gradually created a sense of order in the harsh and arbitrary world of slavery. In a few regions, slaves won substantial control over their lives. Working lives. During the Revolutionary era, blacks in rice-growing lowlands of South Carolina successfully asserted the right to labor by the task. Under the task system, workers had to complete a precisely defined job each day. For example, digging up a quarter acre of land, hoeing half an acre, or pounding several mortars of rice. By working hard, many finished their task by early afternoon. A Methodist preacher reported and had, quote, the rest of the day for themselves, which they spend in working their own private fields, planting rice, corn, potatoes, tobacco, and for their own use and profit, end quote. Slaves on sugar and cotton plantations led more regimented lives, thanks to the gang labor system. As one field hand put it, there was, quote, no time off between the change of the seasons. It was alluring, clearing more swamp or something, end quote. Many slaves faced bans on growing crops on their own. Quote, it gives an excuse for trading, end quote, explained one order, and that encouraged roaming and independence. Still, many masters hired out surplus workers as teamsters, drovers, steamboat workers, turpentine gatherers, and railroad builders. In 1856, no fewer than 435 hired slaves laid track for the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. Many owners regretted the result. As an overseer remarked about a slave named John, quote, he is not as good a hand as he was before he went to Alabama, end quote. The planters' greatest fear was that enslaved African Americans, the majority of the population in most cotton-growing counties, would rise in rebellion. Legally speaking, owners had virtually unlimited power over their slaves. Quote, the power of the master must be absolute, end quote, intoned Justice Thomas Rufflin of North Carolina Supreme Court in 1829. But absolute power required brutal coercion, and only hardened or sadistic masters had the stomach for such violence. Quote, these poor Negroes, receiving none of the fruits of their labor, do not love work, end quote. Explained one woman who worked her own farm, quote, if we had slaves, we should have to beat them to make use of them, end quote. Moreover, passive resistance by African Americans seriously limited their owners' power. Slaves slowed the pace of work by feigning illness and losing or breaking tools. One Maryland slave, faced with transport to Mississippi and separation from his wife, flatly refused, quote, to accompany my people or to be exchanged or sold, end quote, his owner reported. Masters ignored such feelings at their peril. A slave or a relative might retaliate by setting fire to the master's house and barns, poisoning his food or destroying his crops. Fear of resistance, as well as critical scrutiny by abolitionists, prompted many masters to reduce their reliance on the lash and use positive incentives such as food and special privileges. Noted Frederick Law Olmsted, quote, men of sense have discovered that it was better to offer them rewards than to whip them, end quote. Nonetheless, owners could always resort to violence, and countless masters regularly asserted their power by demanding sex from their female slaves. As ex-slave Bethany Vaney lamented in her autobiography from, quote, the unbridled lust of the slave owner, the law holds no protecting arm, end quote, over black women. Survival strategies. Slavery remained an exploitative system grounded in fear and coercion. Over the decades, hundreds of individual slaves responded by attacking their masters and overseers. But only a few blacks, among them Gabriel and Martin Prosser in 1800 and Nat Turner in 1831, plotted mass uprisings. Most slaves recognized that revolt would be futile. They lacked the autonomous institutions such as communes of European peasants, for example, needed to organize a successful rebellion. Moreover, whites were numerous, well-armed, and determined to maintain their position of racial superiority. Escape was equally problematic. Blacks in the Upper South could flee to the north, but only by leaving their family and kin. Slaves in the Lower South escaped to sparsely settled regions of Florida, where some intermarried with the Seminole Indians. Elsewhere in the South, escaped slaves eked out a meager existence in inhospitable, marshy areas or mountain valleys. Consequently, most African Americans remained on plantations. As Frederick Douglass put it, they were, quote, pegged down to one single spot and must take root there or die, end quote. Taking root meant building the best possible lives for themselves. Over time, enslaved African Americans pressed their owners for a greater share of the product of their labor, much like unionized workers in the North were doing. Thus, slaves insisted on getting paid for overwork and on the right to cultivate a garden and sell its produce. Quote, the men folks tend to do the gardens around their own house, end quote, recalled the Louisiana slave. Quote, they raise some cotton and sell it to a massa and get a little money that way, end quote. Enslaved women raised poultry and sold chickens and eggs. An Alabama slave remembered buying, quote, Sunday clothes with that money, such as a hat and pants and shoes and dresses, end quote. By the 1850s, thousands of African Americans were reaping the small rewards of this underground economy, and some accumulated sizable property. Enslaved Georgia carpenter Alexander Steele owned 4 horses, a mule, a silver watch, 2 cows, a wagon, and large quantities of fodder, hay, and corn. Whatever their material circumstances, few slaves accepted legitimacy of their status. Although he was well-fed and never whipped, a former slave told an English traveler, quote, I was cruelly treated because I was kept in slavery, end quote. The free black population. Some African Americans escaped slavery through flight or a grant of freedom by their owners, and if they lived in the North, through gradual emancipation laws that, by 1840, had virtually ended bound labor. The proportion of free blacks rose from 8% of the African American population in 1790 to about 13% between 1820 and 1840, and then, because of high birth rates among enslaved blacks, fell to 11%. Still, the number of free blacks continued to grow. In the slave state of Maryland in 1860, half of all African Americans were free, and many more were term slaves, guaranteed their freedom in exchange for a few years of work. Northern blacks. Almost half of free blacks in the United States in 1840, some 170,000, and again in 1860, 250,000, lived in the free states of the North. However, few of them enjoyed unfettered freedom. Most whites regarded African Americans as their social inferiors and confined them to low-paying jobs. In rural areas, blacks worked as farm laborers or tenant farmers. In towns and cities, they toiled as domestic servants, laundresses, or day laborers. Only a small number of African Americans owned land. Quote, you do not see 1 out of 100 that can make a comfortable living own a cow or a horse, end quote. A traveler in New Jersey noted, in most states, law or custom prohibited Northern blacks from voting, attending public schools, or sitting next to whites in churches. They could testify in court against whites only in Massachusetts. The federal government did not allow African Americans to work for the Postal Service, claim public lands, or hold a U.S. passport. As black activist Martin Delany remarked in 1852, quote, we are slaves in the midst of freedom, end quote. Of the few African Americans able to make full use of their talents, several achieved great distinction. Mathematician and surveyor Benjamin Banneker published an almanac and helped lay out the new capital of the District of Columbia. Joshua Johnston won praise for his portraiture. And merchant Paul Coffey acquired a small fortune from his business enterprises. More impressive and enduring were the community institutions created by free African Americans. Throughout the North, these largely unknown men and women founded schools, mutual benefit organizations, and fellowship groups, often called free African societies. Discriminated against by white Protestants, they formed their own congregations and a new religious denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, headed by Bishop Richard Allen. These institutions gave African Americans a measure of cultural autonomy, even as they marked sharp social divisions among blacks. Quote, respectable, end quote, blacks tried through their dress, conduct, and attitude to win the, quote, esteem and patronage, end quote, of prominent whites, first Federalists and then Whigs and abolitionists, who were sympathetic to their cause. Those efforts separated them from impoverished blacks, who distrusted not only the whites, but also blacks who, quote, acted white, end quote. Standing for freedom in the South. The free black population in the slave states numbered approximately 94,000 in 1810 and 225,000 in 1860. Most of these men and women lived in coastal cities, Mobile, Memphis, New Orleans, and the Upper South. Partly because skilled Europeans avoided the South, free blacks formed the backbone of the urban artisan workforce. African-American carpenters, blacksmiths, barbers, butchers, and shopkeepers played prominent roles in the economies of Baltimore, Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans. But whatever their skills, free blacks faced many dangers. White officials often denied jury trials to free blacks accused of crimes, and sometimes they forced those charged with vagrancy back into slavery. Some free blacks were simply kidnapped and sold. As a privileged minority among African Americans in the South, free blacks had divided loyalties. To advance the welfare of their families, some distanced themselves from plantation slaves and assimilated white culture and values. Indeed, mixed-race individuals sometimes joined the ranks of the planter class. David Barlin, one of 12 children born to a white Mississippi planter, and his black slave Elizabeth, himself owned no fewer than 18 slaves. In neighboring Louisiana, some free blacks supported secession because they owned slaves and were, quote, dearly attached to their native land, end quote. Such individuals were exceptions. Most free African Americans acknowledged their ties to the great mass of slaves, some of whom were their relatives. Quote, we's different from whites in color, in talk, and in religion and beliefs, end quote, said one. Calls by white planters in the 1840s to re-enslave free African Americans reinforced black unity, knowing their liberty was not secure so long as slavery existed. Free blacks celebrated on August 1st, the day slaves in British West Indies won emancipation, and sought a similar goal for enslaved African Americans. As a delegate to the National Convention of Colored People in 1848 put it, quote, "Our souls are yet dark under the pale of slavery," end quote. In the original American caste system, free blacks stood as symbols of hope to enslaved African Americans and as symbols of danger to most whites. Summary. In this chapter, we focused on the theme of an expanding South. Beginning about 1800, planters carried the system of plantation slavery from its traditional home in the Upper South to the Mississippi Valley and beyond. Powered by cotton, this movement westward involved the forced migration of more than 1 million enslaved African Americans and divided the planter elite into aristocratic paternalists and entrepreneurial capitalists. We also examined the character of white and black societies in the Cotton South. After 1820, less than a third of white families owned slaves, and another third were yeoman farmers. Propertyless tenant farmers and laborers made up the rest. Many whites joined evangelical Protestant churches, as did blacks, who infused their churches with African modes of expression. Indeed, church and family became core institutions of African American society, providing strength and solace amid the tribulations of slavery. Finally, we explored the initiatives taken by the free black population in both the northern and southern states to achieve individual mobility and to build community institutions. These efforts resulted in a church-based leadership class and a black abolitionist movement.